At 1:05 on June 6, 1944, the side door of a C-47 Skitran yawned open over Normandy, and Private Marcus Himes stepped into chaos. Tracer rounds clawed upward through the black sky, red and white lines stitching the darkness beneath the aircraft. Himes was 20 years old, on his first combat jump, with no kills and no real understanding yet of how close death could be. Below him, the Cotentin Peninsula waited. The 82nd Airborne Division was dropping more than 6,400 paratroopers behind enemy lines with a single, unforgiving objective: seize the bridges over the Mortars River. If German reinforcements crossed those bridges, Utah Beach would be strangled, and the entire invasion could collapse before sunrise. Himes jumped. The ground came up fast. He hit hard, rolling through mud and tall grass, landing barely 25 feet from a dirt road. Before he could even assemble his rifle, the growl of an engine cut through the night. A German motorcycle passed within yards of his position. Two soldiers rode by, silhouettes against the faint glow of distant fires. He didn't move. He didn't breathe. All around him, men were dying without firing a shot. Weeks earlier, the Germans had flooded the Mortars Valley, turning what should have been a narrow river into a swamp nearly 1,000 yards wide. Paratroopers burdened with 70 pounds of gear sank straight down when they landed in water. By dawn, commanders would find empty parachutes floating in shallow pools, their owners gone beneath the mud. Himes pushed inland. By first light, he linked up with 11 men from Company A, 505th Parachute Infantry Regiment. Their objective was La Fière Bridge, 2 miles west of St. Miraglisse. The bridge spanned a narrow stone causeway, 500 yards long, completely exposed, and it was the only dry route west of the Mortars. If the Germans held it, American forces coming off Utah Beach would be trapped on the coast. The invasion would stall before it truly began. Lieutenant John Dolan did something almost miraculous that morning. By 6 o'clock, he had assembled nearly 90% of his company. Most airborne units were scattered across 10 miles of countryside. The 505th wasn't. They had trained for night jumps in England until every man could navigate in darkness, guided by instinct, sound, and discipline. They moved through hedgerows and flooded fields, advancing toward the bridge. At a manor house near La Fière, they ran straight into trouble. 28 German infantrymen, dug in and waiting. What followed was 30 minutes of brutal, close-range fighting. Grenades thundered through stone rooms. Rifles barked at point-blank range. When it was over, the manor was theirs. At 13:45, 2 paratroopers crawled forward to scout the bridge itself. German soldiers tried to ambush them from the far side. Private James Mattingly dropped the first man instantly, then wounded and captured the rest. The bridge, miraculously, was clear. A 9-man blocking force was placed at the western end of the causeway in the hamlet of Cockaigne. A captured German truck was shoved sideways to block the road. Anti-tank mines were planted beside it. Himes was assigned to a bazooka team with PFC Leonard Peterson. Peterson was Swedish, barely spoke English, but could place a rocket exactly where it needed to go. They dug in behind a concrete telephone pole near the manor, facing west toward Cockaigne. The pole was 2 feet thick, enough to stop rifle fire, but nothing more. Across the road, 2 more bazooka men, John Balderson and Gordon Prime, took position. Behind them, a 57mm anti-tank gun and a machine gun covered the length of the causeway. Everyone understood the problem. The Germans had tanks. They had bazookas and rifles. Major Frederick Kellum, commanding 1st Battalion, knew exactly what was coming. The causeway was a perfect kill zone, 500 yards of open ground with no cover. Any armor crossing, it would be visible the entire way. And German armor was already massing in Cockaigne. At 1600 hours, the first shells hit the manor. German mortars began walking their fire along the eastern bank of the Mortars. Stone walls absorbed most of the shrapnel, but the message was clear. A counterattack was coming. Himes checked his rockets again. Peterson calmly adjusted the bazooka's sights. They didn't say a word, but every man at La Fière knew the same truth. If German tanks crossed that causeway, the fate of Utah Beach would be decided right here. They counted their ammunition in whispers. Between Himes and Peterson, there were 6 bazooka rockets left. The 57mm anti-tank gun behind them had maybe 20 shells, if none misfired. That was everything standing between 3 German tanks and the open road towards St. Miraglise. At 1700 hours, the sound finally came. A deep metallic grinding, tank tracks on stone, rolling out of Causeway and onto the Causeway. It was the sound every man at La Fière had been waiting for since dawn. Peterson slowly raised his head above the foxhole. 3, he said. 3 tanks were moving onto the Causeway, infantry spreading out behind them, rifles at the ready. They were Renault R-35s, French tanks captured in 1940, old and slow, used mostly for training and static defense. Each weighed around 10 tons, carried a 37mm gun, and wore thin side armor, about 12mm thick. Against infantry, they were still killers. A bazooka could punch through them at close range, but only if the shot was perfect. The lead tank rounded the bend 400 yards away. German infantry walked on both sides of the road, maybe 30 men, using the tanks as moving shields. Behind the first Renault came the second, then the third. The German commander understood the terrain. The Causeway was narrow. Only one vehicle could pass at a time. The tanks would absorb the fire. The infantry would follow and overwhelm the American position by sheer weight. Peterson slid a rocket into the launcher. Heim crouched beside him, 3 more rounds stacked within arm's reach. Across the road, Balderson and Prime did the same. The 57mm gun crew adjusted their elevation. Everyone waited. The machine gun in the manor courtyard opened first. Tracer rounds stitched the length of the Causeway, tearing into the German infantry. Men fell. Others scattered into the marsh on both sides, splashing through water that reached their waists. The lead tank never slowed. Its commander stood up in the turret to get a better view, just 20 meters from the western end of the Causeway. The machine gun found him instantly. A burst slammed into his chest. He collapsed backward into the turret. The tank hesitated, then kept rolling. Fire, Heim said. Peterson squeezed the trigger. The bazooka cracked, a flash of backblast erupting behind them. The rocket slammed into the front glacis of the Renault and detonated. The tank lurched sideways, but kept moving. Peterson was already reloading. From the opposite side of the road, Balderson fired. His rocket struck the tank side armor. The explosion rocked it, but still it crawled forward. The 57mm gun fired. The shell punched straight through the turret ring. The tank stopped dead. Black smoke poured from the hatches. The second Renault tried to maneuver around the wreck, but the Causeway allowed no room. Its right track slid off the stone and sank into the marsh. The tank lurched, engine roaring, struggling to climb back onto the road. Peterson fired again. The rocket struck the turret dead center. The tank froze in place. No smoke, no flames, just silence. The third tank began to reverse. Its commander had seen enough. 2 tanks disabled in under 2 minutes. He backed down the Causeway toward Causeway, pulling away from the kill zone. German infantry tried to advance without armor. They didn't make it far. Rifle fire and the machine gun cut them down where they stood. Bodies piled along the road and in the flooded fields. The attack was breaking. Then Heim saw the turret move. The first tank wasn't dead. The gun barrel began to swing, slowly, deliberately, toward Peterson's position. Move! Heim shouted. Peterson was halfway through reloading. Heim grabbed his shoulder. They rolled out of the foxhole, sprinting 10 feet to the left. The tank fired. The 37mm shell hit the concrete telephone pole exactly where they had been crouched 2 seconds earlier. The explosion obliterated 2 feet of reinforced concrete, showering the road with debris. Heim felt the blast slam into his chest like a hammer. Peterson didn't hesitate. He dropped to one knee in the open road, bazooka on his shoulder, completely exposed. German rifle fire cracked around him from 300 yards away. He aimed. He fired. The rocket struck the engine compartment of the Renault. This time, flames erupted instantly. Smoke boiled upward. The tank burned. Heim looked for the third tank. It had stopped retreating. It was turning around, coming back. The last Renault advanced slowly onto the Causeway. Its commander cautious now, methodical. He moved in short bursts. 5 yards forward. Stop. 5 more yards. Stop. Learning from the wrecks of the first 2. And everyone at La Fière understood the truth at the same moment. They had stopped 2 tanks, but the hardest fight was still coming. The turret moved again. Slowly. Methodically. Left. Right. Searching. Heim checked the rockets without looking down. 2 left. Peterson already had one in the tube. That was all of it, 3 shots total, against a tank that now knew exactly where the bazookas were. Behind them, the 57mm gun was silent. Too silent. Hum glanced back over his shoulder. The gun position was gone. A German mortar round had landed directly on it, tearing the emplacement apart. The crew lay motionless around the shattered weapon, helmets scattered, bodies twisted at unnatural angles. There would be no more help from behind. Peterson fired. The rocket streaked down the causeway and struck the front armor of the third Renault, then ricocheted away, skipping off at the wrong angle. The tank didn't even slow. It kept coming. 200 yards from the bridge, Peterson began loading his last rocket. 1 shot left. If it failed, the tank would roll straight across La Fière, turn north towards Saint-Miraglisse, and rip through the scattered American positions beyond. The bridge would be lost. The causeway would open. Everything the Airborne had fought for since midnight would collapse in minutes. Then Heim remembered something. The anti-tank team near the 57mm gun. They'd been carrying spare rockets. "Cover me," Heim said. Peterson nodded and raised his rifle. Heim ran. German infantry on the far side of the causeway saw him immediately. Rifle fire cracked across the road. Bullets slammed into the manor wall, chipped stone exploding inches from his head. Heim stayed low, sprinting through smoke and debris until he reached the destroyed gun pit. 3 dead men. One of them still had a canvas rocket bag slung over his shoulder. Heim grabbed it, ripped it open. For rockets. He ran back the way he came. The tank was closer now, 150 yards from the bridge. Peterson was kneeling in the open road, firing his M1 carbine at advancing infantry, completely exposed. Rounds sparked off the pavement around him. Heim slid into position, tore open the bag, and slammed a fresh rocket into the launcher. Peterson dropped the carbine and took the bazooka. The Renault edged forward, its tracks clanking against the stone. As it maneuvered on the narrow causeway, the tank turned just enough to expose its side armor. The angle was right. Peterson fired. The rocket struck just below the turret ring. The tank stopped. No explosion. No flames. Just stopped. Whether the engine was destroyed or the crew killed didn't matter. The Renault was finished. Across the road, Balderson and Prime used their final rocket to destroy what remained of the second tank. Smoke rolled across the causeway, black and oily, mixing with the smell of burning fuel and cordite. 3 tanks, disabled or burning, on a 500-yard stretch of road. The German infantry hesitated. Then they began pulling back toward Causeway. Without armor, they couldn't cross. That should have been the end of it. But then something unexpected happened. A single American soldier crawled out of a ditch on the friendly side of the road. His name was Joe Fitt. He'd been pinned down by rifle fire for nearly 10 minutes. Now he saw his chance. He broke into a run toward the first burning Renault. German soldiers were still close enough to shoot him. They tried. Fitt reached the tank, climbed onto the hull, pulled a grenade from his webbing, yanked the pin, and dropped it straight through the open turret hatch. 3 seconds later, the grenade detonated inside. The tank burned hotter. That was it. The German attack collapsed completely. Infantry retreated down the causeway. Mortar fire stopped. The battlefield fell quiet except for scattered rifle shots and the crackle of burning fuel. For the first time in over an hour, La Fière was silent. Heim and Peterson stayed in their foxhole, waiting for a second wave. It never came. After 10 minutes, they dared to look around. The machine gun position in the manor yard was empty, the crew dead or wounded. The 57mm gun was gone. They couldn't see anyone else from their company. For a moment, Heim thought they might be alone, that the bridge had fallen everywhere else except here. Then a lone lieutenant came jogging down the road from Saint-Miraglisse. "Hold this position," he said. "Reinforcements are on the way. The Germans may try again." Peterson stayed crouched behind what was left of the concrete pole. Around them, the causeway was littered with bodies and 3 destroyed French tanks. By nightfall, Heim learned the truth. Of the men who had held the bridge that afternoon, most were dead or wounded. The company had lost 17 killed and 51 wounded in a single day. But La Fière Bridge still stood. And the Germans knew now, taking it back would cost them everything. That night, elements of the 508th Parachute Infantry Regiment relieved the position. Heim and Peterson finally left their foxhole after 18 hours under fire. When they stood up, their legs barely worked. They moved back towards St. Mireglès to regroup. Behind them, the Causeway became no man's land. German artillery pounded the eastern bank all night. American mortars hammered Cockaigne on the west. No one crossed in either direction. The 3 destroyed Renault tanks remained in the middle of the road, silent, blackened monuments to the fight for La Fière. At dawn on June 7th, gliders of the 325th Glider Infantry Regiment began crashing into fields east of the Mortaret. Wooden frames shattered against hedgerows and trees, but most of the regiment assembled within hours. Their mission was clear: break the stalemate at La Fière. And General James Gavin, Assistant Division Commander of the 82nd Airborne, was about to take personal command because he understood exactly what was at stake. The Causeway was a killing ground. 500 yards of exposed road, raised above flooded marshland, with no cover at all. German machine gun crews had every meter ranged in. Mortar teams had their firing data written down. Anyone who tried to cross in daylight would be shredded long before reaching the far bank. But the war didn't care. The 4th Infantry Division was pushing inland from Utah Beach, and they needed that road west. Without La Fière Bridge, the entire Cotentin Peninsula operation risked stalling before it truly began. On the western side of the Mortaret, Lieutenant Colonel Charles Timms was already trapped. Elements of 2 companies from the 507th Parachute Infantry had been cut off since D-Day. They were holding an orchard east of Amfreville, surrounded on 3 sides, low on ammunition, with no radio contact to division headquarters. Timms sent patrols toward La Fière again and again. None made it through. On June 8th, General Gavin tried another option. He ordered Major Teddy Sanford to take 1st Battalion, 325th Glider Infantry Regiment north of the Causeway, and cross the flooded river at a shallow ford Timms' men had discovered, maybe 3 feet deep. Sanford moved at night. They were halfway across when the Germans counterattacked. Machine gun fire ripped across the water. Mortar rounds crashed into the column. Men disappeared into the darkness, some dragged under by equipment, others cut down where they stood. Sanford had no choice. He pulled the battalion back. The ford was unusable. Another attempt followed. Colonel George Millet tried to push west from Amfreville to break through and reach Timms. The Germans were waiting for him too. Millet and several of his men were captured. The rest were driven northeast, back toward the river. Every flanking maneuver failed. The Germans still held Cockaigne in strength. They weren't giving up the western end of the bridge. By the evening of June 8th, Gavin was out of options. 7 Corps needed the road cleared immediately. The invasion timetable didn't bend for flooded fields or machine guns. There was only one solution left: a frontal assault. Straight down the Causeway. Gavin assigned the mission to the 325th Glider Infantry Regiment, specifically 2nd Battalion, 401st Glider Infantry Regiment, attached as the 325th's 3rd Battalion. The battalion commander was Lieutenant Colonel Charles Carroll. Carroll's men had never been in combat. They had landed by glider on June 7th, less than 48 hours earlier. Now they were being ordered to charge across 500 yards of bare stone under concentrated fire. The officers didn't sugarcoat it. They called it what it was: a suicide mission. The men agreed. That evening, Gavin met with Carroll and laid out the plan. At dawn on June 9th, the battalion would assault across the Causeway. 12 Sherman tanks from the 746th Tank Battalion would fire in support. 155mm guns from the 90th Division Artillery would pound Cockaigne for 15 minutes before H hour. After that, the tanks would stop. The glidermen would cross on foot. Carroll listened. He studied the map. He looked toward the bridge, barely visible in the fading light. Then he looked back at Gavin and said he understood. But Gavin saw something in his eyes that unsettled him. Doubt, fear, hesitation. The assault was scheduled for 10:30 a.m. June 9th. Carroll had 12 hours to prepare his battalion. 12 hours before they would walk into the most concentrated fire any of them had ever faced. 12 hours before La Fière Bridge would be taken or lost for good. At 6 a.m. on June 9th, Captain John Sauls walked the length of the stone wall near La Fière Manor. Behind it, G Company, 325th Glider Infantry Regiment, waited in silence. Men pressed shoulder to shoulder, weapons cleaned, helmets pulled low. They could hear the German guns on the far side of the marsh, and they knew exactly where they were going. The men were quiet. They had spent the night watching bodies drift in the flooded marsh beside the causeway. Paratroopers from earlier attacks, faces pale under the moonlight, web gear still strapped to them. No one needed to explain what that meant. Everyone understood exactly what waited out there. Captain John Sauls had asked for smoke to cover the assault. Division said no. There weren't enough smoke rounds to spare. The tanks and artillery would have to do the job alone. Sauls studied the causeway again. 500 yards of bare stone road. Perfectly flat, perfectly exposed. The old plane trees lining it had been shredded by days of shelling. Nothing left but splintered trunks and broken limbs. No concealment. No cover. Just open pavement under German observation. Behind La Fière Manor, 12 Sherman tanks from the 746th Tank Battalion moved into firing positions along a low ridgeline. Their commanders ranged their guns on Causeway. Through binoculars, German positions were clearly visible, machine gun nests dug into rubble, mortar pits along the marsh edge, infantry moving between shattered stone houses. The Shermans would fire over the heads of the attacking glidermen. It was better than nothing. At 10 a.m., General James Gavin found Lieutenant Colonel Charles Carroll near the jump-off point. Carroll had been wounded slightly in his glider landing 2 days earlier. Nothing serious, but now he looked pale. His hands trembled as he held the map. Gavin asked if the battalion was ready. Carroll said yes. His voice didn't sound convinced. Gavin didn't have time for doubt. He told Carroll to get his men moving. The barrage would begin in 30 minutes. At 10:45, the battalion would cross. Carroll nodded and walked back toward his men. Gavin watched him go and felt a knot tighten in his stomach. Something wasn't right. At 10:30 a.m., the artillery barrage began. 155mm guns from the 90th Division opened up, pounding Causeway for 15 minutes straight. Shells screamed overhead and detonated among the stone houses. Walls collapsed. Roofs vanished. Dust and smoke rose in thick columns over the western end of the causeway. The Shermans joined in. 75mm rounds slammed into German positions along the marsh. The ground shook. The noise was overwhelming. Men crouched behind the stone wall with their hands over their ears, teeth clenched, hearts hammering. Nearby stood Captain Robert Ray with 90 paratroopers from the 507th Fière. Gavin had given him clear instructions. If the glider men broke under fire, Ray's men would charge the causeway and take over the assault. Ray understood exactly what that meant. The glider men were green. They had never been in combat. Under concentrated machine gun fire, they might freeze or panic. Ray's paratroopers were veterans. They would finish the job if it came to that. At 10:45, the barrage lifted. Silence fell over La Fière. For 10 seconds, nothing moved. Then Gavin gave the order. Attack. Carroll was supposed to lead his battalion forward. He didn't move. Gavin walked up to him and repeated the order. Carroll said he didn't feel well. The glider crash wound was bothering him. He couldn't lead the attack. Gavin stared at him for 3 seconds. Then he relieved Lieutenant Colonel Carroll of command on the spot. Major Arthur Gardner took over 2nd Battalion, 401st GIR, immediately. He didn't hesitate. He'd seen the hesitation coming. He knew there was no time to waste. Gardner found Captain Sauls and told him to get G Company ready. Sauls nodded. He had already ordered the bodies of dead paratroopers dragged away from behind the stone wall. His men had seen enough death. They didn't need it staring at them from their own jump-off point. Sauls looked down the line. Most of his soldiers were 18 or 19 years old. They had been in the army less than a year. Now they were about to sprint across 500 yards of open road into German machine guns. He thought about what to say. There was nothing to say. He checked his carbine, took a breath. Then he vaulted over the stone wall and shouted 2 words. Follow me. G Company rose as one and surged forward. Sauls was in front. Behind him ran 80 men carrying rifles, bars, grenades, and ammunition. They hit the causeway at a sprint. German machine guns opened fire immediately. The first man fell 10 yards onto the bridge, shot through the chest. He dropped without a sound. 2 more went down before the company reached the midpoint. Bullets cracked past at waist height. Ricochets sparked off the stone surface. Sauls kept running. If he stopped, everyone behind him would stop. If they stopped on the causeway, they would all die. Behind them, the Shermans fired from the ridge near La Fière Manor. 75mm shells roared overhead and slammed into Causeway. The noise swallowed everything. Fear, thought, even time itself. The charge was on. Orders were useless now. No one could hear them anyway. The noise swallowed everything. Artillery, tanks, screaming metal, the crack of machine guns. Men couldn't hear each other. They couldn't hear themselves shout. All they could do was lock their eyes on the back of the man ahead of them and keep moving. 100 yards onto the causeway, the German mortars found their range. 81mm rounds detonated directly on the road. Steel fragments tore through the column. Men fell in clusters, 3, 4 at a time, dropped where they ran. The stone surface became slick with blood. Soldiers stumbled, stepped over bodies, slipped, regained their footing, and kept going. There was nowhere else to go. Forward was death. Backward was death. So they went forward. Faster. E Company followed G Company onto the causeway. Then F Company. Within minutes, the entire battalion was committed. More than 400 men charging down a road barely wide enough for 2 soldiers to run side by side. German artillery joined the mortars. 105mm shells landed among the glider men. Explosions flung bodies into the flooded marsh on both sides of the road. Men vanished into the water and did not come back up. From behind the stone wall, Captain Robert Ray watched in disbelief. He had orders to take over if the 325th broke. They weren't breaking. They were dying, but they were not stopping. Ray saw men crawling forward with shattered legs, dragging themselves with their hands. He saw soldiers hoist wounded comrades onto their backs and keep running while bullets cracked inches away. The glider men were green troops, but they were proving themselves in the worst way imaginable. Halfway across the causeway, disaster struck again. A Sherman tank hit one of its own mines. The Americans had laid anti-tank mines on June 6th to stop German armor. No one had cleared them before the assault. The explosion tore the Sherman apart and blocked half the road. Flames shot skyward. Ammunition cooked off inside the hull. The causeway narrowed to a single-file choke point. Men squeezed past the burning tank one at a time. German machine gunners saw it instantly. They poured fire into the gap. Bodies piled up around the wreckage. Men fell forward into the flames, into the water, onto each other. Still, the charge continued. Captain John Sauls reached the western end of the causeway. Cockaigne lay directly ahead. Stone buildings, hedgerows, German infantry firing from windows, doorways, shattered walls. Sauls dove into a roadside ditch. What was left of G Company piled in beside him. Maybe 40 men remained out of 80. They had crossed 500 yards under fire and lost half the company, but they were across. The first American bridgehead on the western side of the Murderette was theirs. E Company came up behind them. Then elements of F Company. The Germans responded with everything they had. Machine guns, mortars, rifle grenades. The Americans were pinned in shallow ditches, unable to push deeper into Cockaigne. Then the counterattack began. Infantry from the 91st Luftland Division surged out of the hamlet, 200 men, maybe more. They hit the American bridgehead from 3 sides. The glider men were outnumbered, exhausted, and cut off. The causeway behind them was still a killing zone. No reinforcements could cross. On the left flank, Captain Wayne Pierce, commanding C Company, pushed forward aggressively. His lead platoon broke into Cockaigne itself. Then the Germans closed in. The platoon was cut off 40 yards ahead of the main line. Machine gun fire pinned them in a roadside ditch. Rifle grenades burst overhead. German infantry began moving to flank them. They had minutes, maybe less. Private First Class Charles de Glopper saw it happen. 22 years old. From Grand Island, New York. Armed with a Browning automatic rifle. He had been in the Army 18 months. He had never seen combat until 3 days earlier. Now he was watching his platoon get destroyed. De Glopper made a decision. He ordered his squad to pull back through a gap in the hedgerow behind them. Then he stood up. Alone, he stepped out of the ditch and onto the road, in full view of the German positions. He raised his bar and fired a burst at the nearest machine gun nest. 20 rounds. The gun went silent. De Glopper moved forward. German infantry shifted their fire away from the withdrawing platoon and onto the single American standing in the open. A rifle round struck him in the left shoulder. He staggered, but he did not fall. The impact twisted his body halfway around. De Glopper staggered, fought for balance, and stayed on his feet. He brought the bar back up and kept firing. Short, controlled bursts. One machine gun nest went quiet. Then another. He swung the weapon toward a cluster of German soldiers pushing through a hedgerow, their helmets bobbing as they advanced. Out of the corner of his eye, he saw his squad. They were crawling through the gap in the hedge. One by one. Low. Fast. Alive. They were getting out. That was all that mattered. A second bullet slammed into his side. He sucked in air, stumbled, but refused to go down. Blood spread across his uniform, dark and fast. He dropped to one knee in the middle of the road and jammed the bar against his thigh for support. The world was narrowing now. Sound dulled. Vision tunneled. He could barely make out shapes anymore, just flashes of light where enemy weapons fired. He aimed at those flashes and squeezed the trigger. The bar bucked in his hands. The barrel smoked. He'd burned through 3 magazines, 60 rounds, maybe more. German infantry were closing in from both sides. They could see he was alone. They could see he was wounded. They advanced carefully, waiting for him to collapse. De Glopper fired again. 2 Germans went down. The rest dove for cover. Behind him, his squad reached the American lines. All 9 men. They had made it, because of him. A third round struck De Glopper square in the chest. This one drove him forward, face first onto the road. The bar clattered across the stone. He reached for it, fingers scraping uselessly against the pavement. His hands wouldn't respond. Everything felt far away, like it was happening to someone else. Still, he dragged the weapon back toward him. Still kneeling. Still facing the enemy. He braced the bar against the road and fired one last burst. Then a 4th bullet hit him in the neck. His body went limp and collapsed sideways onto the causeway. The bar fell silent. German infantry approached slowly, weapons raised. When they reached him, they found him dead. Around his body lay 8 German soldiers he had killed in the final minutes. 2 machine gun positions, the ones that had been pinning his platoon, were silent and destroyed. The bridge had held. Because of De Glopper's sacrifice, Captain Pierce was able to regroup what remained of C Company and push deeper into Causeway. E Company and G Company linked up with them. By noon, American forces held the western end of the causeway in strength. The Germans fell back toward Auville. The 91st Luftland Division had lost too many men trying to hold the hamlet. They could not push the Americans back across the Murderette. That afternoon, General James Gavin crossed the causeway himself. He needed to see it. When he reached the western end, he stopped and turned, looking back toward La Fière Manor. What he saw never left him. The causeway was carpeted with bodies. American soldiers lay where they had fallen, some killed instantly, others having crawled forward until they no longer could. Gavin later wrote that he could have walked from the church at Causeway back to La Fière Bridge without ever stepping on stone. There were that many bodies. He didn't yet know the final numbers. That would take days. But he knew the truth immediately. More than 200 casualties. Possibly closer to 300. The heaviest single loss the 82nd Airborne Division had suffered in the war. Paid yard by yard, body by body, on 500 yards of exposed road that would not be surrendered. But La Fière Bridge held. The causeway was open. At 0400 on June 10th, the lead elements of the 357th Infantry Regiment, 90th Infantry Division, began moving west across the stone road. They passed the shattered remains of the battle as they advanced, destroyed Renault tanks still blocking parts of the causeway, a burned-out Sherman resting at an angle, blackened and silent. They passed bodies that had not yet been recovered. Behind them came more infantry, then armor, then artillery. Column after column rolled westward. Everything that had been trapped east of the Murderette River for 4 long days was finally moving again. The German defense of the Cotentin Peninsula was collapsing, and it had all hinged on 500 yards of stone road and the men who refused to surrender it. The Battle of La Fière Bridge lasted 4 days, from June 6th to June 9th, 1944. In those 4 days, more than 250 American soldiers were killed fighting for that single causeway. Another 300 were wounded. The German 91st Luftland Division lost 2,212 men in the first 6 days of the Normandy campaign. Many of them died trying to hold, or retake, La Fière. A single company of the 505th Parachute Infantry Regiment jumped into Normandy with 136 men on D-Day. By the time they were relieved in July, only 33 were left. The rest were dead, wounded, or missing. Marcus Heim survived. Leonard Peterson survived. John Boulderson and Gordon Prime survived. All 4 bazooka men who destroyed 3 German tanks in 90 seconds on June 6 were awarded the Distinguished Service Cross, the second highest decoration for valor in the United States military. Private First Class Charles de Glopper did not survive. His body was recovered from the road at Cockaigne after the fighting ended. On February 28, 1946, his father accepted the Medal of Honor on his behalf at a ceremony in Grand Island, New York. De Glopper was the only soldier of the 82nd Airborne Division to receive the Medal of Honor for actions in Normandy. His citation described how he deliberately exposed himself to enemy fire, standing alone in full view of German machine guns so his squad could escape. How his body was later found surrounded by dead enemy soldiers and destroyed gun positions. The official U.S. Army historian S.L. A. Marshall was present in Normandy. He interviewed survivors. He walked the battlefield. Years later, he wrote that La Fière Bridge was the fiercest battle of the European War. Not the largest, not the longest, but the fiercest, the most concentrated violence, in the smallest space, over the shortest time. The strategic importance of La Fière cannot be overstated. Without that bridge, American forces advancing from Utah Beach would have been trapped on the coast. German counterattacks from the west could have driven the invasion back into the sea. The entire D-Day operation depended on the 82nd Airborne Division holding a handful of bridges over the Murderette River. La Fière was the most critical of them all, and it was held by a few hundred paratroopers and glider men, armed with rifles and bazookas, against tanks, artillery, and superior numbers. Today, the causeway is known as Marcusheim Way. A bronze statue called Iron Mike stands overlooking the battlefield, depicting an airborne soldier at the moment of landing. It was dedicated on June 7, 1997. An identical statue stands at Fort Benning, Georgia. Near the bridge is a memorial plaque listing the names of 144 paratroopers from the 505th who were killed in action. Charles de Glopper has his own memorial stone at the western end of the causeway. Marcusheim returned home after the war. He lived quietly until October 22, 2002, and was buried with full military honors in Middleburg, New York. He rarely spoke about La Fière. When asked, he would say only that it was one of the hardest days of his life. He never claimed to understand why he and Peterson survived when so many others did not. Only the good Lord knows, he said. And the stone road where it all happened remains, silent now, bearing the weight of what was paid to keep it open.